Hi, welcome to Simply Human, our YouTube channel and podcast. Hi, Karen.
Hey, Christina. So as you can tell, my background has changed. I'm actually in a hotel room. I'm in Virginia right now.
Yeah, and thank you for covering for me when I was out camping for my birthday.
Yeah, and thanks for pushing me to do it because I'm like, ah! But then I reframed it and everything was good. So, living the life, living the
walking,
life.
walking the talk, walking the talk.
Oh, walking the talk, not living the talk, but close enough.
So, last episode, Karen did a short on reframing, and we called It's Not Always About You. So, if you missed it, we're going to put a link down in the show notes. And Karen went over the unconscious and human tendencies to self reference and compare ourselves to others and over personalize, and how to use something called context reframing, which is going from a narrow focus, which is usually on ourselves, to having a broader focus where we're taking in more of the context to help us reframe, be curious, and what else could be contributing to the situation, looking for this positive intentions and to change how we feel about the situation. When we were talking about it, Karen used the metaphor of a camera with an aperture that is narrow or wider. And I realized that I had a different metaphor in my brain, which was more of a picture frame. And as we talked about it, we realized there's different ways to reframe. And so we wanted to do another episode to go a little bit deeper into something that's called perspective reframing. And perspective reframing, it isn't about narrow or broad, it's about having a different perspective. It's about bringing something fresh and creative, maybe challenging ourselves, or even just a completely new way of looking at something.
And I think what's important here is to notice that both are important because as Christina described to her reframe, like, oh, I do that too. Because I think one is related to yourself, but the other one is in relationship to others. I just wanted to emphasize that once you learn the skills that we're talking about, you use both and it becomes a habit to use both. And that's really what began to transform me and the
Right,
way I
it's
see the world.
different situations are gonna
Yes, different
call for the
situations.
different strategy. So,
Exactly.
with Karen, we were talking about Karen works in a corporate environment with teams, and so there's often this dynamic about other people saying something or doing something and a person over personalizing. So that's a reframing in an interpersonal dynamic. But when I am working with clients, a lot of times maybe there's other people involved, maybe there's not. Maybe it's just your own inner critic. And so there isn't necessarily a broadening, there's not necessarily context. It's just this habit on how we approach things. And so you want to know the full range of reframing based on the situation that you're in. And we're going to go over better understanding what we mean by this perspective reframing, and then also some strategies you can use in both situations and a couple strategies that are unique to this type of situation.
That before we start, we really would love for you to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit that notifications button, and as you begin to listen to this podcast or at the end, forward it to the people that you know who could hear this because we really do believe there's things that when we say things, it might remind you of somebody that you send it out of love.
Yeah, and if you're listening to the podcast, folks, if you get a chance, if you look at the show notes on your podcast, whether you're getting it on Apple or Spotify, you'll see there's a link that says text us. And then you can actually text us a comment or a question through the podcast. So this is a new feature, and we just wanted to bring it to your attention.
So let's start to dive in. Ready?
Yeah,
I'm going to
let's
go
go.
ahead and just remind everybody the frame of reference that we're talking about are very much the unconscious processes that grow out of our own life experiences. We all have different life experiences. It's our innate brain wiring. Remember, we've talked a lot about that, like how we're wired through the cultural influences, our beliefs, and just even that, what we call the lizard brain. And they all create the shortcuts, or what I've talked about before, those neural pathways in your brain on how to interpret a situation. And what the beauty of the brain is, though, is You don't need to live like that. I've learned that. Like, I can actually build new neural pathways. Now, don't be like my mom who said, "No, I can't change. I can't change. I'm too old to change." And I realized that no matter what age, true, right? No matter what age, you can change your neural pathways when you really feel that discomfort and you know that something isn't sitting right with you. And that's the whole thing that we're all trying to do. The purpose of reframing, very simply, is to challenge the way that you see a situation or experience and changing the way so that when you interpret it, so that you could alter its meaning and impact. And usually it's turning a negative impact into a more positive one or constructive one. And then allowing you to actually have more choices on how you choose to react. And that's what I love about it. When Christina used those words, I love it because it's slowing it down so that you can react differently. And so this is about the practice. Like when you think about when you learn a new whatever, you do it a little more slower just to listen and pay attention and know it. And then when you practice it, it becomes part of the neuro pathway now, right? So
Mhm.
that's the exciting part for it.
Now, I want to make sure that people understand that reframing, we are not talking about gaslighting yourself. Like we're not talking about denial. I had this idea of your house is on fire, but you're like, well, but look at the beautiful landscape. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about self-deception. We're not talking about telling yourself something that actually is really bad is actually good. We're not talking, that's not reframing. And it's also not invalidating or minimizing your experiences. That's also not what reframing is about. Karen talked about how this process of you either can be zoomed in on your personal perception or you can have this broader context. Another approach to reframing, like I said, like for me, is thinking about a painting, and the painting represents the situation just as it is. And where you get to choose is what kind of frame are you going to put around the painting. To help visualize this is if you're on YouTube, here's an example. And if you're on the podcast, what people are looking at is a cropped image from the creation of Adam fresco. It's the part where God's finger is about to touch Adam's finger. And there's three of them, and each one has a different frame. So the middle one has more of a Baroque frame. It's really, kind of fancy and gaudy. There's no matting. It's kind of almost the same colors as in the painting. Another version is the painting, but it's surrounded by white matting and a really modern black frame. And then the third one is also surrounded by white matting, but it's got like a silver wood frame. It's a little bit more classical looking. And as you could see, that the different frames will actually change the mood, the impact, and even how the painting makes you feel by just having that different frame. Hey, Karen, like when you look at
Oh
these, what
my gosh. Now I finally get to know what you mean. It's so interesting because when you look at the Baroque, it means so formal to me. It feels like the
mm,
museum type of picture. And that this is the way, like the way I saw is like the way it, I don't know, like how it should be or something. It's like
like
kind of interesting.
traditional. It's like looking through the
Yeah,
lens of
like,
tradition.
yeah, like, yeah. Well, the way like passed down, passed down, passed down. But when I look at what is in today's world, it's like more the frame with the silver type of. It kind of blends it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it kind of blends it. And then the black frame is so funny because it makes me just focus on the picture. It's like
Hmm.
kind of like zones in, right? This is a great way to think about it. It depends on what you need because sometimes it's just for you to just look at it differently, or maybe it's just changing the word. And so, depending on how you are reframing it, it's your choice because everybody's so different.
So this is one example of where if the picture represents the situation, you can see it's the same situation, but having a different frame changes how it feels to you. So that's one way to think about this type of perspective reframing.
Yeah,
But
I just want to say something. It's really funny because the Baroque made it feel more heavier. And then
Yeah.
the other one made it feel so much lighter. And so, of course, I want that lighter feeling because the rose like brings my shoulder down, like, so that's interesting. It's so true.
It does. It does affect your mood and how you feel and the
It does.
emotions. Yeah. And so there's other ways. There's some other examples. Here's another. Let me just take this down. Here's another one. So if you're on the podcast, it's an image. It says, "What is your frame?" And there's a drawing of half a glass of water. And then there's a checkbox that says half full, half empty. Half full and half empty are both frames that you could use with this class, with half full being more of a perspective of abundance and possibility, and the glass half empty tends to have more of that mood of scarcity or pessimism.
As you're going through these images that Christine is giving to you, I'd love, 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 love for you to comment. When you think about the frame, there's a comment about there, or even are you more half full, half empty? I'd love for you to comment whether you're on a podcast after the podcast, if you can, or in the YouTube while you're in it. Are you half full? Are you typically half empty? And it's an interesting concept. So keep going.
Yeah, because this is a practice, because really what we're going to get to is you need to practice this, and awareness is the first practice to start to become aware of what are your habits. What is your frame that seemed you didn't even realize you carry around with you all the time? So half full, half empty is one. This is another way of thinking about framing. So if you're on the podcast, I'm sure you've come across this in your lifetime. It's a picture of a black vase, and you can see a vase, but if you look at it just a little differently, what you see are the profiles of two faces looking at each other. So, what is a frame? Is this a vase, or is this two people looking at each other? And this is an example of a frame could be both and, or a frame could be either or is a frame. And then the last one I have is, "What is your frame?" And it's a picture of Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh and the gang. I mean, we've got Rabbit, we've got Tigger, we've got Piglet and Eeyore. And this is a really good metaphor or example of how our attitudes, our emotions create a frame. So if you're familiar with the Winnie the Pooh characters, you've got Eeyore, who tends to look at everything through this woe is me perspective. Oh, yeah. His friends will go and build his little lean to of sticks, and he'll say, "Oh, yeah, it's probably going to fall apart tomorrow." Or you've got Tigger, who looks at everything like it's a party. Or you've got Rabbit, who's always looks through this anxious frame, always worrying about something's going to go wrong. And I love, like, whether it's Winnie the Pooh or Wizard of Oz or Star Wars or even like your favorite TV show like Friends, whenever you have an ensemble, usually each character is representing a archetype or pattern that you might be able to relate to and say, "Oh man, yeah, I definitely tend to have an Eeyore point of view, or I have a rabbit. I'm anxious all the time." Karen, do
I
you
think I'm
relate
a
to?
Tigger now more than I
I
used to be.
Tigger is said to have ADHD, so I'm not surprised that you
Ding, ding,
picked
ding,
her.
ding. Yeah, yeah.
I think I'm more the Christopher Robin. Just kind of take care of everybody and be supportive and caring about how they feel. I want to share an explanation that is from this NPR podcast called Invisibilia that I really loved. Unfortunately, they're not doing it anymore, but you can still find it on wherever you get your podcast or just on the internet, called Invisibilia. And this episode was called Frames of Reference. It's a really, really good episode, and it covers two different situations. It's particularly good if you are on the autistic spectrum, because one of the stories is about an autistic woman who didn't understand what it was she was missing. She didn't have a frame of reference for emotional communication or nuance. And then she went on a clinical trial for this brain stimulation that allowed her to be able to suddenly have these frames of reference for about half an hour. And all of a sudden, she started understanding everything that she had been missing and misunderstanding in her life. And it was both a challenging experience, but also a transformational experience. And then the second story is with Hassan Minaj. He's a comedian, and it's about the differences between his father's frame, who is coming as an immigrant from a conflicted country, and then Hassan, who's growing up in America. And so when Hassan has difficult experiences, his dad's like, his frame of reference is so different. He's like, oh, so what? Not a big deal. And just talks about how this is where culturally or family or life experiences, it helps you really understand that frame. And then what they explain is the idea is it's not your objective situation that determines your happiness. It's the invisible frame of reference that you carry in your head, a frame of reference that you don't even know consciously that you're using, but you are using it and it
Interesting.
filters your experience of the world and how you're feeling.
Hmm.
Unquote. So this is a quote from the podcast. So, what we're going to do is Karen's going to lead us now in some strategies on how to work with this type of perspective reframing.
So, what's very interesting about this is when you start with identifying those automatic and habitual patterns in our thinking, because that's really what it's about. It's in our thinking. And what that allows you to do is really focus on bringing to awareness your framing habits. And this is what we're trying to talk about earlier when she did those pictures that you see up now. So, let's go back to the two of us. The whole point of it is that when you think about that strategy, it's notice how you react to the situation and notice the judgment that you're making internally, because that begins you to understand and use the stories like Christina just described, the stories like Winnie the Pooh, Wizard of Oz, Star Wars. There's so many of those different personality symbols, or even if you watched recently Inside Outside 2 with the different
Oh,
emotions too. That was great. How would you describe your own pattern? Do you tend to be Winnie the Pooh or whatever, or do you tend to be even with, like she had the glass half full, half empty type of thing as well? And then the best way is when you start to note, all you gotta do is notice, like so big. It's just a little bit of just noticing. Once you want to notice, you begin to notice. What's great about it is if you could keep a thought journal to track the habitual or the eliminating thoughts, that's something that we'd recommend that you do. I think that's
yeah.
the one of the best things, right?
Yeah. And then another thing that you can do is once you start noticing what those thoughts are, if you have a tendency, say, to be glass half empty or have that Eeyore or that rabbit anxious way of looking at things, is you want to start challenging those automatic thoughts. Question, are these valid thoughts? So some strategies is to say, are there facts that are supporting how
Yep.
I'm looking at this? Or is this just am I just feeling anxious about it, but the facts don't really support it? Or when you're thinking about the glass half full, glass half empty, can you find facts to support either side? Well, I could look at it this way, or I could look at it that way. That'll help start getting some cognitive flexibility. Also, curiosity. This is one of the strategies for when you're trying to challenge the automatic thoughts. Like, be curious, where did these thoughts come from? Where did this thinking pattern come from? Did you learn it in your family? Is this something that's pervasive in your culture? Is this a way of thinking that you find in your friend group? Like, just bring that curiosity when you're trying to bring awareness. And then that's where you challenge it. Like, well, okay, this was how I was raised, but do I believe is that how I see the world? And really starting to question it and identify what is more authentically you.
And I was even thinking too, because we talk a lot about the difference between facts and assumptions. And a lot of times, assumption seems really like a fact when I'm really realizing later on it's not a fact. It's actually an
Right.
assumption. And I think that's the whole point was when you bring curiosity to even those, what you think is a fact, it just dawns on you that, oh, maybe there's something more to this. That's the whole point of curiosity. There's something more to what you're seeing. Now, the
Mhm.
next one that we want to talk about is actually shifting the perspectives. That's just viewing the situation from a different lens. Now, not like the focus lens to wider perspective, like we were talking about, but you're really considering how someone else would perceive the situation. Like, just imagine if when we talk about the situation that we're using the Winnie the Pooh metaphor, just take it from a different perspective. What would Winnie the Pooh say? What would Eeyore be thinking? Now, maybe you're the Eeyore, so you're saying, what would Tigger say? Bouncing around, what would he say? Just being curious about what all the different possibilities to the story is.
Yeah, and maybe it would help to talk to somebody who you can brainstorm other ways of thinking about it. Or this
Mm-hmm.
is why having a coach is helpful or a therapist is helpful because they can bring that other perspective that maybe is here, like in your blind spot and not easy for you to see. And it helps sometimes to have an outside person help you see that blind spot. And then once you've shifted your perspective and maybe seen a different way that makes sense, again, we're not gaslighting. So I'm not changing the facts of it. I'm looking at it from a different angle. I'm looking at it from a different lens. And then try to find positive language that you use in your reframing. So you might replace words like, oh, this is a problem to, okay, this is a challenge. Or it might be trying on, like, what if I talked about this from a perspective of gratitude? Or what if I talked about this from the perspective of being hopeful? Because it's in changing your language that it really starts to shift your sense of what the reality is. So
So,
you have your perspective, you start to be able to talk about it differently, and then you start to open up to let yourself feel and experience it differently.
and one of the things that I was talking about, and I believe this is one powerful one that I had when I changed the word, just like we did with challenge, from problem to challenge. It honestly, the problem is like, oh, the problem, versus the challenge, like, oh, I can handle this, right? Where a
Right.
problem felt so heavy, like the Baroque foam, like, and yet it's like the word feedback. There was so much Baroqueness in that because incorporates like. But when I was able to learn, it's just their observations. And I'm not just saying observations, I'm saying their observations.
Mhm.
That created a shift for me.
Mhm.
And that meant to me like a Tigger with opportunity versus the ER, like, oh, like that's the same thing. And I think that's the point for me where sometimes you can just use the word and make it more lightly, like you can change a perspective of how you see the word. But sometimes you have to change the word because you have to change the real frame because it creates an emotion drain on you. But that's where you bring in that curiosity to understand that.
Yeah, and I don't remember what episode it was we talked about this, but Karen talked about trigger words. This can go hand in hand with any
Mhm.
work you're doing. Some of you may have listened to that episode and started writing down your list of trigger words. You can go back to that list and say, how many of these words influence the frames on how I look at things and experience things? So that'll reinforce this awareness. Other examples of how this might look in real life. As a therapist, I find that one of the areas where reframing is really important is in relationships. This happens in so many of them. Often there's a situation or something really difficult happens, and it's usually like the female partner is wanting to be able to just experience their emotions and talk about their emotions. And they get frustrated when they find that the partner's response is to say, well, why are you getting upset? And that's not really helping. And that's not going to do anything. Like, you should be happy about, and they go into maybe some gratitude frame.
So true. I just my brain, as you can tell from my lab, like, oh, I was just there the other night. I,
Yeah, we call that an empathic miss when you come in with your frame a little bit too quickly. and it steamrolls over the frame that the other person is operating from.
Mhm.
And so then how it's described to me is my experience is invalidated. My partner is an insensitive jerk. And then I'll challenge them with a different frame. So I'm not saying that their experience didn't happen or invalidate those feelings,
Mhm.
but I could also share with them a different way of looking at it. Like, well, maybe your partner just doesn't want the person he cares about most to be suffering. And that's all, and if I have both in the room, I'll have the guy like going, yeah, yeah, I want to fix it. The reason I want to fix is because I don't want you to suffer because I care about you. And they are hearing the way they're being framed is they're a jerk. So do lots and lots of think about your
True.
relationships. Keep your mind open. Look at how many times you might be framing something and take a step back and say, well, could it be this? Could it be a different frame? Another place that I find that I bring frames to my clients' attention is when we're talking about boundaries.
Mhm.
And again, I'm going to always review this when we talk about boundaries. That there's 3 parts to a boundary. It's knowing what's okay, what's not okay, identifying what's in your control, and being willing to take action. And so what I'll have is someone says, I told them I wasn't feeling up to having company, but they said they would take care of everything, and then they came over anyway. And now their frame is that I'm being manipulated. My boundaries are being disrespected. So my frame is I'm being disrespected. No one listens to me. I'm being manipulated. So the reframe will be like, well, I think maybe you were wishing for something to happen, and wishes aren't boundaries. So perhaps a way to look at this is I was unwilling to take action around what was in my control, and I can learn from this experience. So instead of walking around with, like Karen said, the heavy Baroque frame of, oh, I'm never seen, I'm never heard, and that's the frame, I'm a victim frame.
Mhm.
It's really saying I want to have a learning frame. I want to have a curious frame. Like what happened? Like, okay, I was wishing that they would just, grant my wishes without my doing anything. That didn't happen. And that doesn't feel good. And I want to learn from this experience and get better at my boundaries. That's a completely different growth oriented frame than a helpless victim, I have no power frame. So empowerment, disempowerment, those are frames. Karen, I don't know. Do you have any like in your work? Because I know you do probably a lot more of the context framing, but have you had to come across using this kind of just having a different frame when
I
you're
mean,
working with clients?
well, actually, if you guys saw me when I was laughing or whatever, I was like, oh my gosh. Another instant with my husband came to mind because even though we were married for like 30 some years, I'm like, he should know me by now. He should know me by now, right? But again, it's so easy to forget about positive intention.
A
Like
positive
they're
intention,
not
yeah.
doing it and they're not waking up to say, oh, I'm gonna like try to make Karen so angry today. I mean, I know that he does it out of love, but I forget because I'm on the defensive mode again. And so it's just so interesting where I'm trying to live more, assuming positive intention, but I'm
Mhm.
realizing that I have to work to do that, to assume positive intention. Like there's times when I'm really, really good, but then once my defense, sometimes I just get this, like my ego gets this hold of this thing where it can't do that. It just
Well,
goes negative.
Karen brought this up in the other episode about the role of the lizard brain. So if you remember, the lizard brain creates a frame. So I said these
Yeah.
frames are unconscious. So the lizard brain has a particular frame, and its frame is everything's out to get me. Like there's a saber-toothed tiger. You
Mhm.
have to be vigilant. You have to be looking out for when you're going to be hurt. So to cultivate from your new brain, assume a positive intention, even if poorly executed, that's a frame that we can be in life. So every time the lizard brain says, that's dangerous, that person is trying to hurt me, to stop, to pause, to notice that frame, to shift it and say, well, what if I looked at it as there is some positive intention here? Let me just think about what that could be for a moment. Even if they did it in the first example I gave, where the partner doesn't want their partner to be suffering. And so what they're trying to do is offer solutions or distract by saying, well, look at this shiny object over here. It's not so bad. That isn't a frame of this person is disrespecting me as much as this person's offering the best thing that he has to try to alleviate your suffering. And
Oh, I
even if
like
that
that.
was, yeah, even if that wasn't what you needed in the moment, when you don't have the sort of victim frame and you have that positive intention frame, it allows you to take a breath to try to receive that positive intention and then be able to communicate, hey, I know what you're doing and I think you're trying to be helpful, but this is what I really need right now. Can you just be with me while I feel this? Right. And then you can be more effective.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too, because when you're saying that, I just kept thinking about it. Why I'm more successful than I have been in the past is because I'm more attuned, or I can feel my body now because I feel this hunching all the time every time my lizard brain comes in. I swear I feel this because this is my move. Like I go down. I go because that makes sense. I'm protecting myself. So it goes
Right,
down
right.
and I can feel it. And that's when I realized more and more that I just have to just breathe and be curious. So every time I feel like this, I know my counteraction is curiosity and positive intention. So I created this habit of thinking like that. Now, sometimes it takes longer to remember that, but majority of the time, I'm getting much better. I'm much happier than I used to be. I remember because I always, but it's whether it's in talk to someone else or even when I'm like ashamed. I mean, I told you earlier at one of the episodes, I'm sure it was several episodes. I told you, I always felt ashamed. Right? It wasn't just I didn't feel guilty. I always feel ashamed. So I always felt like I'm just sad, so sad, just like want to hide my face now. And even for myself, I got to realize that what I did was a positive intention. It's not like I did it to like screw up my life. It's just I did it for the right reasons that I chose to do something. And I don't have to be ashamed of it. It's just an experience that I learned and I learned from it and to move on because I can feel bad or whatever. But to me it's interesting where body will tell you.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up because we're kind of coming to the end. What Karen just said, bringing awareness, using your body to help be a signal to you.
Hmm.
We all roll our shoulders in when we're feeling stressed because of that instinct to protect our vital organs or that shame response. So your body can help you. Keeping a journal can help you. Having someone brainstorm with you is a way that can help you. Just being curious. These are all practices to help you start becoming more aware of what your unconscious frames are when they're popping up, and then being able to pause, be curious, and then try some of these other strategies. And it does take practice. Over time, it does get what Karen was saying, it gets easier and easier and easier. And we want to thank you for tuning in today. We hope that this was helpful. I'm going to put a link to that podcast from Invisibilia. And we hope that if you have some questions about how would I reframe here, just either put it in the comments below or you can email us at simplyhuman.connect@gmail.com.
So again, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review. We'd love to have a review or comment, and do your thumbs up if you thought this was a great exercise. For it to other people. And what Christina said earlier, send us a comment if you want, or even like share your own reframe experience, like those pictures that we gave you earlier. Or do you feel like you're more of an E or whatever? It could be via an email to us. So then, or just let us know. And you could say before, I used to be an Eeyore, but now I feel like I'm a Tigger. Because that's what I would say. I used to be an Eeyore until I learned about reframing, and now I feel like I'm more of a Tigger because I can be more positive, intention, and curious.
Well, and we probably have different situations
Mm-hmm.
bring
Oh,
up
that's
different
true.
frames.
I'd be different. Oh, good one, Christine. I forgot
Yeah.
about that. Because we're all adapting. Like there's certain
Yeah.
situations that where I'd be an Eeyore because that's where my way of being unconsciously is still set right now until I learn to create a new one.
Well, it might be in your work environment.
Yeah,
There's
it's true.
situational stressors evoke a certain type of frame, and it's very different from your frame of reference that you use when you're with your friends. Maybe you have more expansiveness, more flexibility. more lightness, and maybe when you're at work, you have more that Baroque, heavy, you know,
Environment
weighty
does make a difference. Yeah.
frame. And even that, like being aware of your frame and asking yourself, am I able to change it in this environment? And if not, is this the right environment for
Oh,
you?
beautiful. Beautiful to add too. And so we are like over time because we just love this topic and we love sharing our thoughts with you. We look forward to the next time.
All right. See you guys later.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.